Welcome back to Mr. Dreadmere. Tonight, I have 12 true scary van life overnight horror stories. Before we begin, you make sure you're subscribed, because once you step onto the Mr. Dreadmere, you don't walk alone. I was already awake when the first knock landed, sharp and close, like knuckles on thin metal, and my breath caught before I could stop it. I lay there frozen in the back of the van, lungs half full, listening to the sound fade into the dark. I told myself it was nothing. A branch, a bird, the van settling, anything that didn't involve someone standing inches from my head. I let the breath out slowly. The moment my chest emptied, the knock came again, perfectly timed, as if it had been waiting for that exhale. I sucked in air fast, heart racing, and the knock followed. Not louder, not softer, just there, exactly when my ribs expanded. I stared at the ceiling, eyes wide, counting nothing, because counting felt like it would give the sound permission to continue. I held my breath. The silence pressed in so hard it rang in my ears. No knock. My lungs burned. When I finally had to breathe out, it came back instantly, precise, intimate, as if the van itself had learned my rhythm. I whispered, "Hello," without knowing why. The words sounded too loud, too fragile. The knock didn't react. It just waited for my next breath and answered it. I pressed my hand flat against the metal wall beside my head, feeling for vibration. Nothing. The sound felt external, but it moved with me like a shadow. I rolled onto my side, curling inward, trying to make myself smaller, trying to disappear from whatever was listening so closely. I tested it, breathing shallow, fast, slow. Every change was mirrored. In through my nose. Knock. Out through my mouth. Knock. I clamped my lips shut and breathed through my teeth. Knock. I held again, longer this time, until my vision prickled. Silence. My chest felt like it might tear open. When I gasped, the knock came hard enough to make me flinch, right by my ear, like a reprimand. I sat up, dizzy, and the sound stopped for a fraction of a second, just long enough to make hope flare. Then it resumed, now matching the quick, panicked rise and fall of my breathing as I tried to steady myself. I swung my legs down and planted my feet on the floor, grounding myself in the cramped space. The van smelled like salt and damp fabric. My throat was dry. I told myself to think logically. Something was causing a pressure change. Wind, temperature, my own movement. I opened the side curtain a sliver and peered out. Darkness pressed back, thick and empty. No silhouettes, no movement. The knock came with my breath, even as I held still, even as I barely moved a muscle. I closed the curtain again, heart hammering, and leaned forward, resting my forehead against my knees. The sound shifted with me, always close, always personal, like it was inside my lungs instead of outside the van. I remembered reading about sleep paralysis, about auditory hallucinations, about how the brain can betray you when you're tired. I dug my fingernails into my palm, sharp enough to hurt, to anchor myself. The pain was real. The knock was real. They existed together, and that scared me more than if I could have dismissed one of them outright. I stood swaying, and the sound followed, breath for breath, a private metronome that I couldn't escape. "Stop," I said louder now, anger creeping in around the fear. I held my breath again, staring at the metal wall like I could intimidate it. Silence. My chest screamed. Sweat broke out along my spine. I exhaled through my nose, slow and controlled, and the knock answered, gentle now, almost patient. Tears sprang to my eyes, not from pain but from the sheer intimacy of it, the way it felt tuned to me alone. I stumbled toward the front of the van, each step unsteady, and fumbled for the keys. The sound stayed with me, sensing to my panting breaths as I tried to calm down enough to think straight. If I drove, would it stop? Would motion break the pattern? I hesitated, hand on the ignition, Afraid that turning the engine would somehow invite something worse, the knock waited for my next breath and met it, unfazed. I forced myself to sit in the driver's seat and buckle up, hands shaking. I took a deep breath and held it, counting the seconds by the pounding in my ears. No knock. I started the engine on the exhale, the noise roaring to life around me. For a moment, blessedly, I couldn't hear anything else. I breathed shallow, barely daring to inhale. The engine idled, steady and loud, and underneath it, faint but unmistakable, the knock returned, perfectly in time with my breath, as if it had been waiting for the noise to die down just enough. I laughed then, a brittle, hysterical sound that surprised me. The knock didn't care. It followed the laugh, following my breath as it broke and stuttered. I slammed my foot on the accelerator and pulled forward, not bothering to check anything but the empty stretch ahead. As the van rolled, the sound faltered, missed a beat, then found me again. I drove faster, breath ragged, eyes burning, and the knock chased me, clinging to my lungs like a parasite. It only stopped when I forced myself into a dangerous calm, breathing so slowly it hurt, stretching each inhale until my chest ached, and each exhale until my vision blurred. I pulled over without thinking, coasting to a stop, and held my breath until my body shook. Silence. When I finally let the air out, nothing happened. No knock. I waited, barely breathing, terrified to test it. The engine ticked as it cooled. The night pressed in, but the sound was gone. I sat there until my hands stopped shaking, until the urge to breathe normally overpowered my fear. When I finally did, carefully, the knock didn't return. I waited longer, then longer still, listening for any echo, any hint, nothing. I drove away from that spot without looking back, not stopping until the sky lightened and the world felt solid again. Later, in daylight, with sleep and distance between me and that night, I thought about what I knew. The van's ventilation system, the way pressure changes can create sounds, how carbon dioxide buildup can mess with your head, how panic can amplify patterns. I checked everything. A loose panel near my head, a vent that opened and closed with subtle shifts in air pressure, my own breathing creating a vacuum, metal responding like a drum. I saw the child in my side mirror while I was brushing my teeth, bent over the little sink in the back of the van, spitting carefully so I wouldn't spill water on the floor. I froze with my mouth half open, toothpaste burning my gums, eyes locked on the reflection. Small frame, hooded jacket, standing just behind the rear wheel, far enough back that I couldn't see a face, only the outline of a head tilted slightly as if watching me. I straightened slowly, heart hammering so hard it made my ears ring. The child didn't move. The mirror image stayed perfectly still, like a photograph clipped into place. I told myself it was a trick of the glass, a tree stump, a backpack, anything but what it clearly looked like. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand and leaned closer to the mirror. The shape sharpened instead of dissolving. "Hey," I said, my voice thin and wrong in the small space. No answer. I opened the back door, metal creaking too loud in the quiet, and stepped down onto the dirt. The space behind the van was empty. No child, no movement, just the dark line of trees pressing in at the edge of the pull-off. I scanned left, right, behind me, my breath coming fast. Nothing. I turned back to the mirror. The reflection showed nothing but the side of my own van and the empty ground beyond it. I stood there longer than made sense, waiting for something to reveal itself. When it didn't, I told myself I was tired. I'd been driving too long that day. My brain was filling in gaps. I climbed back inside, locked the door, and sat on the bed until my breathing slowed. I didn't see the child again until later, when I was already lying down, half asleep, listening to the quiet settle around me. I rolled onto my side and glanced out the window without thinking. A habit I had from years on the road. The mirror caught my eye. The child was back, closer this time, standing almost directly behind the van, still facing me. Still turned just enough that I couldn't see her face. A wave of cold rolled through my chest, like my body had recognized something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. I pulled the curtain aside a fraction and looked out directly, empty. I snapped it back and checked the mirror again. The child was there, unchanged, unmoving, like it existed only in that narrow angle of glass. I sat up and hugged my knees, trying to think clearly. If there was a real child out there, alone in the forest at night, that was a problem. I should help, I should call out, I should do something. But every time I looked directly outside, there was nothing. Only when I looked at the mirror did the child exist. That felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, like a rule I didn't know I knew was being broken. I opened the driver's door and stepped out, leaving it open behind me so I wouldn't feel trapped. I walked slowly around the van, calling softly, asking if anyone was there, if they needed help. My voice sounded small against the trees. The ground was damp and soft under my boots, and I watched it carefully, expecting to see footprints appear as I walked. There were none except my own. When I came back around to the side mirror, I stopped short. The ground around the van was marked now, a ring of small footprints pressed into the dirt, circling the vehicle in a perfect loop. They didn't lead toward it. They didn't lead away. They just went around and around, evenly spaced, as if someone had walked laps without ever stepping closer. My stomach dropped. I crouched and touched one of the prints. The edges were sharp, fresh. This wasn't old. This wasn't my imagination. I stood and checked the mirror. The child was gone. I backed into the van and locked the door, hands shaking so badly I dropped the keys. I scooped them up and sat in the driver's seat, staring at the mirror like it might betray me again at any second. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. No movement. No sound. I started to convince myself I was safe, that whatever had made the prints was gone. Then I saw the child again. This time the reflection showed the figure much closer, almost pressed to the side of the van, head angled as if trying to see inside. I could make out more detail now. Thin arms, a jacket too big for the body wearing it, still no face. I turned my head and looked out the window. Directly beside me, nothing. I turned back to the mirror. The child remained unblinking. A sob climbed up my throat before I could stop it. I whispered, "What do you want?" to the glass, to myself, to whatever was listening. The child didn't react. I tried something then, an idea that came from pure desperation. I held my breath and watched. The child didn't move. I let the air out slowly. Still nothing. I leaned forward, heart pounding, and shifted my position slightly. The child stayed exactly where it was in the reflection, like it wasn't reacting to me at all, only existing in that fixed relationship to the mirror. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming the beam out the window, sweeping the area where the reflection showed the child standing. The light cut through empty air, no body, no shadow. I aimed the light directly at the mirror. The glare washed out the image completely. For a moment, there was nothing but white. When I angled the beam away, the child was gone again. I didn't sleep. I sat there all night watching the mirrors, checking them every few minutes, afraid to let my guard down. Each time the child appeared, the pattern was the same, only in the reflection, only at certain angles, always paired with new footprints in the morning, circling the van without ever closing the distance. By dawn, exhaustion had hollowed me out. The forest looked ordinary in the daylight, almost gentle. I climbed out and studied the ground carefully. The footprints were still there, a complete ring around the van, smaller than my own, too small to belong to any adult. They stopped abruptly where the dirt met gravel, no sign of where they had come from or where they had gone. I packed up and drove away as soon as I could, not stopping until I reached a town with people and noise and movement. I told myself I'd forget it. I told myself it was a one-time thing. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want the looks, the questions, the way people get when they think you've spent too much time alone. It followed me anyway, not every night, not even often, but sometimes when I parked somewhere quiet and checked my mirrors out of habit, I'd see the child again, always the same size, always the same clothes, always no face, and always in the morning the footprints would be there, circling my van like a boundary line drawn just for me. I started experimenting because I needed answers. I parked in different places: gravel, asphalt, packed earth. The prints only appeared where the ground could hold them. I covered my mirrors one night, taping cardboard over the glass before it got dark. I didn't see the child at all that night. In the morning, there were no footprints. The next night, I uncovered just one mirror. The child appeared there, and the prints formed a half circle on that side of the van. That was when understanding finally crept in, slow and awful. Whatever this was, it wasn't following me. It wasn't stalking me. It was responding to being seen. The mirror wasn't showing me the child. It was inviting it. The realization made my skin crawl. I spent the next day removing both side mirrors completely, unscrewing them with shaking hands, leaving bare metal and exposed wiring. I drove without them, checking my blind spots by leaning forward and turning my head, like I was learning to drive all over again. It felt dangerous, but not as dangerous as keeping them. That night I parked in another quiet place and waited. I slept deeply for the first time in days. No child, no footprints, no sense of being watched. I put the mirrors back on weeks later, after I'd convinced myself it was over. I needed them. I couldn't keep driving blind forever. For a while, nothing happened. I relaxed. I stopped checking them so obsessively. Then one night, months later, I caught a glimpse of the child again, just for a second, reflected in the glass as I passed a storefront window. I slammed on the brakes, heart in my throat, and looked back. Nothing. No footprints that time. No lingering presence. I sold the van not long after that. I drive now without mirrors that catch more than they should. I avoid looking at reflections when I'm tired. And when I see a child standing somewhere they shouldn't be, I don't assume they're lost anymore. I assume they're exactly where they're meant to be, waiting to be noticed. I pulled off the road because my eyes wouldn't stay open anymore. Simple as that. Easing the van into a patch of flattened gravel that felt unofficial but usable, engine ticking as it cooled. I remember thinking I'd stop for an hour, maybe two, just enough to reset, then keep driving. There was no sign announcing a rest area, no name, no distance marker, just a widened shoulder tucked into the forest like it had been forgotten on purpose. I shut off the engine and sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, listening. The road behind me was quiet, but not dead. I could sense it the way you sense a room with people in it, even before anyone speaks. I checked my mirrors, then leaned forward and peered through the windshield. The road stretched straight ahead, dark, featureless. I didn't like that I couldn't see where it curved or dipped. It felt unfinished. I climbed into the back and lay down without even taking my shoes off. The first thing I noticed was how complete the silence was once the engine noise faded from my ears. Not peaceful silence, flat silence, the kind that presses in instead of opening up. I told myself forests do that at night. I'd slept in worse places. I closed my eyes. I don't know how long I was out when the headlights passed the first time. but they lit up the inside of the van in a smooth, white sweep, left to right like a car driving by on the road. I opened my eyes and waited for the sound to follow. Tires, wind, anything. Nothing came. Just the fading glow sliding off the metal walls. I sat up, heart thumping, listening hard. Still nothing. I told myself the road dipped just right. That sound carried strangely out here. I lay back down, slower this time, and stared at the ceiling until my breathing evened out again. The second set of headlights came sooner. Same motion, same brightness, same silence. This time I rolled onto my side and watched the light move across the curtain, tracing seams and wrinkles. No engine, no rush of air. It was like someone was dragging a flashlight along the outside of the van at highway speed. I checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising. But the time bothered me. It said just after midnight. I could have sworn I'd only been asleep a few minutes. I sat up and swung my legs down, suddenly wide awake, every nerve buzzing. I opened the driver's door and stepped out. The forest felt closer now, the trees leaning in, their dark mass swallowing whatever starlight there might have been. I turned toward the road, half expecting to see taillights disappearing into the distance. There was nothing. The asphalt looked empty in both directions, smooth and undisturbed. I walked a few steps along the shoulder, scanning for reflectors, signs, anything familiar. That was when I noticed the posts. The metal poles were still there, evenly spaced along the roadside, but the signs themselves were gone. Not fallen, not bent, removed cleanly, like someone had unbolted them with care. I stared at the blank posts, a cold weight settling in my stomach. I walked farther, faster now, counting the posts. All of them were bare. Directional signs, warnings, distance markers, every single one stripped down to metal. The road felt longer without them, stretching on without context, without reassurance. I turned back toward the van, suddenly eager to be inside it again. As I reached the door, headlights swept over me, bright enough to throw my shadow across the ground. I spun around, raising a hand against the glare, ready to shout. The light moved past me and was gone. Still no sound. My ears rang with the absence of it. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting for the roar that never came. When it didn't, I climbed back into the van and locked the doors, hands shaking just enough to annoy me. I hated that reaction. I hated feeling small. I sat in the driver's seat and faced the road, determined to see something concrete this time. The headlights came again, right on cue, sweeping across the windshield. I leaned forward, squinting, searching for shape, height, anything that would tell me what kind of vehicle it was. There was nothing behind the light, no silhouette, no source, just illumination moving through space, as if it had forgotten what it was supposed to belong to. I thought about leaving, starting the engine, putting distance between me and this place. But another thought crept in, quieter and worse. Where would I go? I had no idea which direction led out. With no signs, no landmarks, the road felt suddenly interchangeable in both directions. Like choosing wrong might not just delay me, but trap me. The headlights passed again, and again. Each time the same speed, the same arc, the same silence. I tried counting the seconds between them, but the intervals shifted just enough to throw me off. My sense of time began to feel unreliable, like it was being gently nudged out of alignment. I forced myself to breathe slowly and think logically. Headlights without sound meant reflection. Something off the road. Maybe another road intersecting nearby. Maybe distant traffic catching angles just right. I got out again, this time with my flashlight, and walked deeper into the pull-off, sweeping the beam across the trees, looking for anything reflective. The forest swallowed the light after a few meters. Nothing shone back. When I turned around, I froze. The headlights were there again, closer now. lighting the van from behind, throwing long shadows ahead of me. I stood perfectly still, watching the light slide across the metal, waiting to hear it pass. It didn't. The light stopped. I felt my throat tighten. The van glowed softly, evenly lit, like it was on display. I waited. My breath sounded too loud in my ears. After a few seconds, the light moved again, continuing its path and vanishing down the road. Still no sound. I backed toward the van without turning my back on the road, got inside, and locked myself in again. My heart was pounding hard enough that I felt it in my teeth. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and laughed once, quietly, just to break the tension. The sound died immediately, swallowed by the space. I decided then that I wasn't sleeping here. I didn't care which direction I chose. I just needed motion, noise, something real. I turned the key. The engine coughed, then started. Loud and comforting. I pulled onto the road and picked a direction at random, eyes straining to catch any sign of progress. I drove for what felt like a long time without seeing anything change. No intersections. No markers. The road stayed straight, the forest unbroken. The headlights passed me even as I drove, sliding by in the opposite direction, still silent, still wrong. They didn't react to my presence at all. Panic crept in then, slow and insidious. I checked the fuel gauge. It hadn't moved. I checked the clock. It hadn't moved either. Midnight stared back at me, frozen. I slammed my hand against the dashboard, swore out loud, just to see if anything would respond. I turned around, heart racing, and drove the other way. Same result. Same unchanging stretch. Same passing lights. I was moving, but the world wasn't. The realization settled into me like a physical weight. This place wasn't between destinations. It was outside them. I pulled over again, breathing hard, and forced myself to think. The signs were gone. The lights had no source. The road had no direction. Everything pointed to one conclusion I didn't want to accept. This wasn't a place you left by driving. I got out one last time and walked to the nearest signpost. I wrapped my hands around the cold metal and pulled with everything I had. It didn't budge. I leaned my forehead against it and closed my eyes, feeling foolish, desperate. Then I did the only thing I hadn't tried yet. I turned around and walked off the road, straight into the forest. The ground resisted me, branches grabbing at my clothes, roots threatening to trip me, but with every step the pressure in my chest eased slightly. The headlights still passed on the road behind me, but they felt farther away now, less relevant. After several minutes I stopped and turned around. The road was gone, not hidden, not obscured. Gone. No asphalt, no shoulder, just trees where it should have been, dense and ordinary and indifferent. I stood there until my legs trembled, then laughed again, louder this time, half hysterical, half relieved. I spent the rest of the night walking, following the slope of the land, trusting my instincts in a way I hadn't in years. Eventually, I reached a different road, a real one, with signs and sounds and the distant hum of traffic that made my eyes sting with tears. I never found that rest area again. I drove past where it should have been in daylight. There was no pull-off, no blank signposts, just uninterrupted forest. I don't stop at unmarked places anymore. And when I see headlights without sound, I don't wait to understand them. I leave before the road forgets where it's supposed to go. I woke up because my feet were warm, not comfortably warm but wrong, like heat coming from the floor instead of my blankets, and it took me a second to understand why that felt so unsettling. I lay still in the dark, breathing quietly, pressing my heels down to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The metal beneath the mattress felt warm, almost like the engine was still running, even though I knew I had shut it off hours ago. I told myself it was leftover heat, that I'd driven longer than I realized. That metal held warmth. Still, I shifted my legs away from the edge and pulled my knees up, suddenly protective of the space beneath me. The van was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you aware of every tiny sound your own body makes. I waited for the heat to fade. It didn't. I slid my hand down and pressed my palm flat against the floor. It was warmer than my skin. Not hot, but undeniably warm, concentrated toward the center of the van. A shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold outside. I pulled my hand back and wiped it on my blanket, my heart starting to beat harder for no good reason I could name yet. I lay there listening, straining to hear something underneath the van. A scrape, a cough, breathing, anything that would explain the warmth in a way I could deal with. There was nothing. No sound at all. The snow outside muffled everything, turning the world into a sealed container. I held my breath, then slowly let it out, testing whether the quiet would crack. It didn't. I sat up and swung my legs over the side, careful not to touch the floor again. My mind started reaching for explanations, cycling through them too fast to settle on any one. An animal, heat from the exhaust, some quirk of insulation. Each idea collapsed under the weight of how specific the warmth felt, how localized. Like a body, size shape pressed up from below. I put my boots on without turning on the light, moving slowly, deliberately. The last thing I wanted was to announce myself if someone really was under there. The thought made my stomach twist. Someone under my van meant someone close enough to hear me breathe, close enough to feel my movements. I swallowed hard and reached for my jacket. When I opened the side door, cold rushed in and cut through the stale warmth inside, sharp enough to make my eyes water. I stepped down into the snow and crouched automatically, scanning the space around the van. The ground was smooth and white except where my tires had pressed down earlier. No footprints, no disturbances, nothing that suggested another person had been anywhere near me. I walked to the front and knelt, leaning down to look under the chassis. Darkness stared back at me, thick and unreadable. I clicked on my flashlight and aimed it underneath, sweeping slowly from one side to the other. I saw snow shadow the underside of the van. No legs, no shapes, no sign of movement. My shoulders sagged with relief I hadn't realized I was holding back. I stood up, embarrassed at myself, and laughed softly. Of course there was nothing there. I was tired, alone, letting my imagination get ahead of me. I told myself to get back inside, warm up, and sleep. As I turned toward the door, something caught my eye on the snow near the middle of the van. The snow there was thinner, melted down in an oval shape, like someone had pressed a giant hand into it and held it there. The edges were smooth, not trampled, not disturbed by steps, just melted. My breath fogged in front of me as I stared, dread creeping back in, heavier this time. I crouched and touched the snow. It was wet and slushy, soaking into my glove immediately. The ground beneath was warm, not engine warm, body warm. I pulled my hand back quickly, my pulse thudding in my ears. The shape was unmistakable now, long and narrow, the length of a person lying flat. I backed away until I hit the side of the van, pressing my spine against the cold metal. My thoughts tangled, racing in circles. Someone had been there. Someone had been lying under my van long enough to melt the snow. Someone close enough to hear me shift in my sleep, to feel the vibration of my movements above them. I forced myself to breathe and looked again under the van, flashlight shaking in my grip. Still nothing. The space was empty now, but the evidence remained undeniable and fresh. I followed the melted area with my light and noticed something else then. Something that made my skin crawl. There were faint impressions leading away from the melted patch. Shallow marks where the snow had been compressed. Not footprints, but drag marks. They led toward the back of the van and stopped abruptly, as if whatever made them had simply vanished. I stood there shaking, every nerve screaming at me to leave, to get back inside and lock myself in, or start the engine and drive until daylight. I did neither right away. Fear had pinned me in place, my mind struggling to process the reality of what I was seeing. Eventually, instinct won out. I climbed back into the van and slammed the door shut, locking it with a loud click that sounded pathetic in the vast quiet. I sat in the driver's seat and stared straight ahead, hands clenched so tight they hurt. I didn't turn the engine on yet. I listened. For a long time, nothing happened. No movement, no sound, just my own breathing, too loud, too fast. I watched the mirrors, half expecting to see someone rise up from behind me, but they stayed empty. Slowly, reluctantly, my heartbeat began to slow. I stayed awake until morning, flinching at every imagined sound, replaying the image of that melted patch over and over in my head. When the sky finally lightened, I stepped out again, braver in daylight, but no less shaken. The snow around the van told the full story now. The melted oval was still there, refrozen overnight into a shallow depression. Around it, the snow was compressed where someone had shifted their weight. I could see where knees had pressed, where elbows had dug in. There were even faint impressions of a head, turned slightly to one side, facing the underside of my van. I felt sick. This wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too human. Someone had chosen that spot. Someone had stayed there for hours. The idea that they had listened to me sleep, that they had been that close without me knowing, made my chest tighten painfully. I checked the area around me carefully and found no footprints leading away, nothing to tell me where they had gone. It was as if they had melted back into the forest or the cold itself. I packed up quickly, hands still shaking, and drove away without eating, without stopping, putting as much distance between me and that place as I could. Later, after I reached town and sat in a diner with shaking hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, I started to think more clearly. Thunder Bay had its share of transients, people living rough in the winter, doing whatever they could to survive. A van parked alone on the outskirts might have looked like shelter, like warmth. That explanation made sense. It grounded the experience in reality. It explained the warmth, the lack of footprints, the way someone might crawl under a vehicle to escape the cold wind. It didn't explain why they hadn't made a sound, or why they hadn't left tracks, but it was enough to stop my mind from spiraling. Still, even with logic on my side, something lingered. The careful way the snow had melted, the patience it implied, the thought that someone had chosen not to wake me, not to announce themselves, not to ask for help. They had just stayed there, silent, using my presence without my knowledge. I don't park alone in winter anymore. I choose lit areas, populated places, anywhere someone under my van would have nowhere to hide. Sometimes, when it's cold and I feel heat coming up from the floor, my body reacts before my mind does, muscles tensing, breath catching. I tell myself it was just a person trying to survive. I believe that most days. But I still check the snow before I sleep, and I still remember how it felt to realize I wasn't alone, even when I thought I was. I was tightening the last strap on the door when the wind surged hard enough to rock the van, and I remember laughing under my breath, because it felt ridiculous to be nervous about weather when I'd parked here on purpose. I climbed into the driver's seat, turned the headlights on to check the turnout one more time, and saw nothing but empty ground fading into darkness. That was when the voice said my name, clear and calm, right at the edge of the light. I froze with my hand still on the switch, convinced at first that my brain had stitched a sound together out of the wind. I waited for it to repeat itself, heart thudding, breath shallow. The wind howled and pushed at the van, but there was no voice. I exhaled slowly, annoyed at myself, and reached to turn the headlights off. My name came again, exactly the same tone, exactly the same volume. As if whoever was speaking hadn't moved an inch. It wasn't shouted over the wind or distorted by it. It was conversational, almost gentle, like someone trying not to startle me. I stared straight ahead, pulse climbing, and whispered, "Hello," without knowing why. No answer. Just wind, pressing and pulling at the metal shell around me. I leaned forward and scanned the area beyond the headlights, squinting for shape or movement. There was nothing there. The light cut off sharply, and beyond it the dark felt deliberate, like a boundary rather than an absence. I shut the engine off and sat back, telling myself to think this through. People didn't wander around rural turnouts at night in weather like this. And even if they did, how would they know my name? I hadn't told anyone where I was stopping. I hadn't even said it out loud since earlier that day, ordering coffee from a woman who'd misgendered me and corrected herself with a blush. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I pulled it out with shaking hands, only to see there was no signal, no notification, nothing. The screen reflected my own face back at me, pale and tight, eyes too bright. I locked it and stuffed it back into my jacket. The voice came again, this time farther away, drifting in from the left, still just outside the reach of the headlights. Same calm tone, same pronunciation. My name used the way I used it, not the old one. Not the one strangers sometimes defaulted to. That detail landed hard in my chest. I cracked the window a few centimeters, just enough to listen more clearly, and immediately regretted it as the wind shoved cold air and grit inside. I strained my ears, heart pounding, trying to separate real sound from the chaos outside. The wind roared and dipped and roared again. Underneath it all, faint but unmistakable, I heard breathing that wasn't mine. I slammed the window shut and hugged myself, adrenaline buzzing through my limbs. Someone was out there. Someone who knew my name. Someone who wasn't trying to hide, exactly, but also wasn't stepping into the light. I turned the headlights off and on again, sweeping the area in white glare. Empty. I left them on this time, unwilling to give up that thin slice of visibility. "Who are you?" I called out, louder than I meant to, my voice wobbling. The words were ripped away by the wind almost immediately. For a moment, nothing happened, and a fragile hope crept in that I'd imagined everything. Then the voice said my name again, closer now, almost at the front of the van. I could tell by the way the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off metal and glass. My stomach dropped. I locked the doors even though I knew they already were, the click loud in my ears. I tried to reason it out. Sound carries strangely in high wind. Voices can travel. Maybe someone was calling to someone else, and my brain was filling in the gaps. Maybe exhaustion was messing with me. I took a few deep breaths, counting them, grounding myself in the feel of the seat beneath me and the steering wheel under my palms. The voice waited until I'd almost convinced myself, then spoke again from farther back, near the rear of the van. Always just beyond the headlights, always calm, always my name, never anything else. I felt hunted, but not in the obvious way. There was no urgency in the voice, no threat, no demand. That was worse. It felt like patience, like whoever it was had all the time in the world and knew I didn't. I turned the engine on, craving the noise, the vibration, anything that would break the spell. The van rumbled to life, steady and real, and for a moment I felt safer. I shifted into drive, planning to pull back onto the road and leave this place behind without another thought. As soon as the van started moving, the voice said my name again, right in front of me this time, so close it felt like it was inside the windshield. I slammed the brakes, heart leaping into my throat. The headlights cut across empty ground. Nothing stood there. No shape, no shadow, no hint of a person. I let out a shaky laugh that turned into something close to a sob. "This isn't funny," I said to the empty air. "You need to stop." My words sounded small, swallowed by the wind. The voice didn't respond immediately. When it did, it was farther away again, near the edge of the light on the right side, exactly where I hadn't looked in the last sweep. My name, spoken like a reassurance. I realized then that it wasn't following me. It was repositioning, staying just out of reach, always in the place I wasn't focused on. The understanding tightened my chest until it hurt. This wasn't random. It was deliberate. I drove forward slowly, keeping the headlights fixed ahead, scanning constantly. The voice kept pace, calling from different points around the van, never overlapping itself, never rushing, as if it knew exactly how fast I was going and where the light would fall. I couldn't tell if it was one voice moving or many voices coordinating. It always sounded the same. My thoughts spiraled, latching onto every story I'd ever heard about voices in the wilderness, about people lured away from safety by something that knew how to sound familiar. I hated myself for thinking that way, for letting fear turn abstract ideas into threats, but I couldn't stop. I stopped the van again and sat there shaking, engine idling, trying to think of a way out that didn't involve running blindly into darkness or sitting still until something happened. The voice used my name once more, closer than before, so close I could almost feel breath against my ear. That broke something in me. I screamed, a raw, wordless sound, and slammed my fist against the steering wheel. The noise felt good, grounding, human. For a few seconds afterward, there was nothing but wind and the engine's growl. No voice. I sagged forward, chest heaving, tears blurring my vision. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve and forced myself to straighten. "Okay," I whispered, to myself as much as anything. "Okay." Think. I remembered something from earlier that day. A ranger I'd chatted with briefly while asking about road conditions. He'd mentioned the wind here, how it could play tricks on you, how sound could bend and stretch in ways that didn't make sense. He'd laughed about it, but his eyes had been serious. I clung to that memory now, to the idea that there was a physical explanation. Even if I didn't fully understand it, I turned the engine off and listened carefully, really listened, separating layers of sound. The wind surged and dipped. Somewhere far off, there was a low, constant moan that I'd ignored before, like air being forced through a narrow opening. I focused on it, followed it mentally, imagining the landscape beyond my sight. When the voice came again, I heard it differently. It wasn't as clean as I'd thought. There was a slight distortion at the edges, a wavering that hadn't registered before. It sounded less like someone speaking and more like something carrying speech. I took a risk then, driven by equal parts desperation and curiosity. I shouted my name into the wind, as loud as I could, and waited. The sound was ripped away instantly. A few seconds passed. Then the voice echoed it back, not perfectly, but close enough to make my skin prickle. Same tone, same cadence. Relief and terror crashed into each other inside me. It was echoing, not a person. Something in the terrain, in the wind, catching my voice and throwing it back at me from unpredictable angles. My name had come from me. I hadn't realized I'd said it out loud earlier, muttering to myself, grounding myself without noticing. I tested it again, saying my name softly, then louder, then not at all. Each time, the voice followed, delayed and displaced, always just outside the light. When I stayed silent, it stopped. I laughed then, shaky and hysterical, The sound tearing out of me. I wasn't being called. I was hearing myself, fragmented and reshaped by the place I'd chosen to stop. The knowledge settled over me slowly, calming my racing heart. I started the engine again, this time with intention, and pulled back onto the road. I didn't speak. I didn't even breathe loudly. The wind roared around me, but no voice rose out of it. The headlights showed empty roads stretching ahead, real and solid. I didn't stop again until I reached a town with lights and buildings, and noise that made me feel small in a good way. I slept in a proper lot that night, surrounded by other vehicles, the sound of human life muffling everything else. Later, when I told a friend about it, I framed it as a lesson about wind and sound and exhaustion. That was all true. But there was another layer I didn't say out loud, the part that still makes my throat tighten when I think about it. Hearing my own name come back to me from the dark, stripped of context and intention, reminded me how fragile identity can feel when you're alone, how easily something familiar can become threatening when it's taken out of your control. I still travel, I still camp alone, but I'm careful now about where I stop, and I'm careful about the words I let the wind carry away. I woke up to my own voice coming from the dashboard, calm and conversational, saying, "No, I didn't tell anyone that." And for a few seconds my brain refused to connect the sound to reality. I lay there staring at the ceiling of the van, heart pounding, listening as the radio continued speaking in a tone I recognized too well to be coincidence. The voice paused, then another voice answered, slightly distorted, laughing in the same way my friend Jonah laughs when he's nervous. "You always say that," the radio replied, and my stomach dropped hard enough to make me feel sick. I hadn't spoken to Jonah out loud since early evening, and certainly not about anything worth recording. I sat up too fast and cracked my head on the cabinet, pain flashing white behind my eyes. The radio didn't react. It just kept going, replaying a conversation I remembered having earlier while leaning against the open van door, watching the last of the light bleed out of the desert. Except this version was cleaner, clearer, like it had been recorded intentionally, not overheard by chance. My hand shook as I reached forward and turned the volume knob down. The voices dropped to a whisper but didn't stop. I twisted the knob harder until it clicked off. Silence filled the van, thick and heavy. I stayed frozen, waiting to see if it would turn itself back on immediately. It didn't. For a moment, the world felt normal again. I could hear my own breathing, the faint ticking of cooling metal, the low hum of blood in my ears. I told myself I'd been dreaming, that my brain had pulled sounds out of memory and layered them over waking consciousness. It happened to people, especially people who slept badly, who lived alone, who spent too much time in their own heads. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and sat there, rubbing my face with both hands. My palms came away damp. I took a deep breath and laughed once, quietly, trying to shake off the unease. "Get it together," I muttered, and the sound of my own voice grounded me more than I expected. The radio clicked on behind me. I spun around so fast my neck protested. The display glowed softly, frequency numbers scrolling without settling. The speaker crackled, then my voice came through again. Closer now, more intimate. "I don't like stopping here," it said, and this time I knew for certain I had never spoken those words aloud. My pulse roared in my ears. I stepped closer, staring at the radio like it might explain itself if I looked hard enough. The voice continued, describing thoughts I'd had but never shared, little private calculations and doubts that lived entirely inside my head. It wasn't guessing, it wasn't approximating, it was exact. I yanked the power cable out of the socket, metal scraping loud in the quiet. The radio went dead instantly. Display dark, speaker silent. I stood there breathing hard, cable clutched in my fist, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting in the driver's seat with my jacket on, watching the desert lighten through the windshield. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard echoes of the radio in my head, my own voice saying things I didn't remember saying, things I wished I hadn't thought. In the morning, logic crept back in. Radios picked up stray signals all the time, especially out here. Marfa was famous for weird transmissions, strange lights, unexplained interference. Maybe someone nearby had been broadcasting on a similar frequency. Maybe my tired brain had filled in gaps, connected dots that didn't belong together. I spent the day telling myself that story. I drove into town, got coffee, chatted with a barista about nothing important. I laughed at the right moments. I felt almost normal by the time the sun started sinking again. I didn't leave. I don't know why. Pride maybe, stubbornness. The desire to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid of my own imagination. I parked in a different spot, farther from the road, and told myself I'd be gone by morning. That night, I turned the radio on deliberately, volume low, scanning through static until I found a music station and left it there. The familiar rhythm soothed me. I cooked dinner, ate slowly, cleaned up. When I finally lay down, the radio was still playing, exactly as I'd set it. I woke to silence. The radio was on, but no station came through. Just a low hiss, undercut by something else, something rhythmic. It took me a second to realize it was breathing. Not mine. Recorded breathing. Uneven and close to the microphone. My chest tightened. I reached forward and turned the volume up, needing clarity even if I didn't like what it would bring. The breathing stopped, replaced by my voice again. "I should have left," it said softly. A reply came immediately, another voice layered over mine, one I didn't recognize. "You still can," it said. I backed away until my calves hit the bed frame. My thoughts raced, trying to build a framework that didn't collapse under scrutiny. Someone was messing with me, recording me, broadcasting it back. But how? When? And why would they know things I'd only thought? The radio kept going, replaying fragments of the evening. The clink of my spoon against the pot, my footsteps on gravel, a sigh I hadn't realized I'd let out. Then it shifted, seamlessly, into something else. "I wonder what he's going to do." My voice said, curious, detached. That wasn't how I thought. That wasn't how I spoke to myself. The wrongness of it sent a jolt of cold through me. I lunged forward and ripped the radio out of the dash, wires snapping with sharp pops. The sound cut off mid-sentence. I stood there holding the unit, heart hammering, adrenaline buzzing through my veins. I threw it out the open door as hard as I could. It hit the ground with a dull thud and lay there, dark and inert. I slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing my back against the metal, shaking. For a long time, nothing happened. The desert outside stayed quiet. No lights, no footsteps, no voices. Gradually my breathing slowed. I didn't sleep again. When morning came, I packed up without eating and drove away, not stopping until the sun was high and the road felt solid beneath me. I threw the radio away later that day, in a gas station trash can miles from where I'd slept. I watched it disappear under coffee cups and wrappers, felt a surge of relief that surprised me with its intensity. Weeks passed, then months. I told myself the explanation I liked best: interference, stress, coincidence. I believed it most days. Sometimes, though, when I'm alone and the world is quiet, I catch myself thinking carefully, guarding my thoughts the way I guard my words. Because I learned something out there that I can't unlearn. Even when you're alone, you're not always unheard. I pulled over without thinking too much about it. easing the van off the narrow strip of asphalt and onto what looked like a maintenance turnout. Gravel crunching softly under the tires. I remember feeling relieved, shoulders dropping, the tight focus of driving finally loosening. The road had been empty for a long time, and my eyes were tired. This spot felt practical, out of the way, quiet. Good enough for a few hours of sleep. I shut the engine off and sat there with my hands still on the wheel, listening to the silence settle. It wasn't the kind of silence that feels peaceful. It was thin, brittle, like it might snap if I moved the wrong way. I told myself that was just altitude, isolation, my own nerves. I'd slept on stranger roads than this. I climbed into the back, pulled my jacket tighter around me, and lay down. The van creaked as it cooled, little pops and ticks that sounded too loud in the quiet. I closed my eyes and tried to let myself drift, replaying the day in my head, letting mundane thoughts crowd out everything else. Sometime in the night, I woke with the vague sense of having been disturbed, like someone had called my name in a dream. My heart was already beating faster than it should have been. I lay still, listening. Nothing. No voices, no footsteps, just the same fragile quiet. I told myself it was nothing and eventually fell back asleep. When I woke again, light was creeping in through the curtains, pale and cold. For a moment, everything felt normal. I stretched, sat up, reached for my boots. It was only when I opened the side door that the feeling shifted. That subtle internal click that tells you something is wrong before you can say why. The ground around the van was marked with tire tracks. Fresh ones. Dark lines pressed into the gravel and dirt, looping and overlapping, cutting close to my doors and then pulling away again. I stepped down slowly, my breath catching, and turned in a slow circle. There were tracks everywhere. They surrounded the van in a loose ring, some passing so close I could see where small stones had been pushed up against my tires. Others veered away and came back again, as if someone had driven in lazy circles during the night. None of them matched my own. My tracks were easy to spot, a single clean line leading in. These were different, multiple, intersecting. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. I crouched and touched one of the impressions. The edges were sharp, not weathered. This hadn't happened days ago. This was recent. My stomach tightened as I straightened and looked up and down the road. The road itself was empty, stretching out in both directions, unchanged. No vehicles, no people, no sign of anyone who could have made those tracks. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting for some explanation to present itself. My first thought was simple: snowplow, maintenance truck, someone doing routine work overnight. The idea calmed me enough to start packing up. I moved quickly, suddenly eager to be back on a main road, back where things made sense. Before getting in, I glanced toward where the road curved out of sight, and noticed something I hadn't seen the night before. A metal barrier stood partway across the road, pushed off to the side, half buried in gravel. Attached to it was a sign, its face turned away from me. I walked over, my steps slow and deliberate. When I reached it, I turned the sign around. The lettering was official, clean, and unmistakable. Road closed. No through access. Beneath that, smaller text explained it had been closed for safety reasons, effective years earlier. I stared at the date, reading it twice, then a third time. The closure wasn't recent. It hadn't happened last season or the year before. According to the sign, this road had been officially closed for years. A tightness spread through my chest. I looked back at the van, at the tracks surrounding it, and felt the ground tilt under me. If the road had been closed that long, who had been driving on it, and why were their tracks so fresh? I took out my phone, hands cold despite my gloves, and searched for information. Signal was weak but usable. Maps showed the road as inactive, a thin grey line marked as closed. Notes mentioned landslide risk, erosion, no maintenance, no traffic. I stood there trying to force the pieces to fit together in a way that didn't leave me feeling exposed. Maybe the closure wasn't enforced. Maybe locals still used it. Maybe someone had ignored the sign, just like I had without realizing it existed. But none of that explained the number of tracks, or the way they circled my van without touching it. None of it explained why I hadn't heard a single engine all night. I got in and started the van, the sound loud and comforting. I drove slowly at first, eyes scanning the road, expecting at any moment to come around a bend and see another vehicle. The road remained empty. As I drove, I noticed how rough the surface was, how little it looked like something that saw regular use. Gravel had drifted across sections of asphalt. Weeds pushed up through cracks. This wasn't a shortcut people took casually. After several minutes, the road opened onto a junction with a maintained route. The transition was abrupt, like crossing a line. Fresh paint, clear markings, signs that made sense. I pulled over just past the junction and sat there shaking, letting the engine idle. I considered turning around, going back to look again, to prove to myself that the tracks were real, that I hadn't imagined them. I didn't. Some instinct told me not to. Later that day in town, I asked about the road. I tried to sound casual, curious, not alarmed. The woman at the counter frowned when I mentioned it, shaking her head. She told me it hadn't been open in a long time, that people weren't supposed to be up there at all. When I mentioned seeing tire tracks, she went quiet for a moment, then shrugged in a way that felt rehearsed. "Sometimes people go where they shouldn't," she said. "Doesn't mean it's safe." That should have been enough, a rational explanation wrapped in local indifference. But it didn't sit right. I could still see the way the tracks curved, how deliberate they'd seemed. I stayed the night in a proper campground, surrounded by other vehicles, lights, and voices. I slept badly, waking often, replaying the image of those marks in my mind. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about the road more than I wanted to, about what it meant for something to be officially closed versus actually unused, about the idea that rules and records don't always reflect reality on the ground. Eventually, the feeling faded. Life moved on, other trips, other nights, other places. But sometimes, when I wake up and step outside to find unexpected marks around my vehicle, my chest tightens in the same way it did that morning. And I remember standing on a road that wasn't supposed to exist anymore, surrounded by evidence that it was still being used, quietly, persistently, without permission. I learned something from that place, something I carry with me now. Just because a road is closed doesn't mean it's empty. And just because you don't hear anyone pass in the night doesn't mean you were alone. I woke up because the van rocked gently. Not enough to feel like someone was shaking it, just enough to register in my body before my brain caught up. I lay still on the thin mattress in the back, eyes open, staring at the dark ceiling, listening for whatever had caused it. The rocking stopped. Silence settled in, heavy and complete. I checked my breathing, slowed it down, waited. Nothing else happened. No footsteps, no voices, no engine sounds from the road. I told myself it had been the wind or the van settling into the gravel. I'd parked late, exhausted, and sleep had been shallow all night. Little movements felt bigger when you were half awake. I rolled onto my side and checked the time on my watch. It was still early, too early to justify getting up. I closed my eyes again, but the sense of wrongness lingered, like an itch I couldn't reach. Eventually exhaustion won, and I drifted back under. When I woke for real, light was filtering in through the front windshield. thin and grey. Morning. My first thought was relief. Nothing had happened. Whatever I'd felt in the night hadn't turned into anything real. I stretched carefully, listening to my joints crack, then sat up. That was when I saw the driver's seat. Even from the back, I could tell something was off. The fabric looked darker, unevenly so, like it had been pressed or rubbed. I leaned forward, heart starting to beat faster, and crawled toward the front of the van. The driver's seat was marked with mud. Not splattered, not tracked in by accident. The impressions were clear and specific. The outline of a torso pressed back into the seat. Creases where damp clothing had folded. A darker patch where someone's back would have rested, and faint smears on the sides where arms had been. I stood there staring, my mouth dry, my thoughts scrambling for order. I hadn't sat there since the night before. I knew that for a fact. When I parked, I'd shut the engine off, climbed straight into the back, and locked the van from the inside. I hadn't opened the front doors again. I hadn't needed to. I reached out and touched the fabric with 2 fingers. It was still damp. A cold wave rolled through my stomach. Damp meant recent, not hours ago, not days. Someone had been sitting there while I slept. I stepped back automatically, scanning the rest of the cab. The passenger seat was untouched. The dashboard was clean. The steering wheel, though, had faint smudges on it, darker than the rest, as if someone with dirty sleeves had rested their forearms there. My pulse thudded in my ears. I checked the doors one by one. Locked. All of them. No broken windows. No signs of forced entry. The van was exactly as I'd left it, except for the evidence sitting inches from where I'd been sleeping. I backed into the rear again and sat on the bed, elbows on my knees, trying to breathe. My mind jumped to the worst conclusions first. Someone had gotten inside. Someone had watched me sleep. Someone was still nearby. I grabbed my jacket and boots, pulling them on with shaking hands. Before opening any door, I listened hard, pressing my ear to the metal wall. Nothing. The world outside felt distant, muted. I opened the side door slowly and stepped out into the cool morning air. The rest pullout was quiet, empty. A strip of gravel, a few tired trees, the road stretching away in both directions. No other vehicles, no people. I turned back to the van and crouched, scanning the ground. That was when I saw the footprints. They came from the edge of the pullout, crossing the gravel toward the driver's door. Muddy prints, heavy, uneven, like someone had been walking in soaked boots. They stopped right at the door. No prints leading away. I followed them with my eyes, my chest tightening. They didn't circle the van. They didn't wander. They came straight in, then ended. I felt sick. I checked under the van, behind it, around it. Nothing. No sign of where the person had gone. It was as if they'd simply disappeared after sitting in the driver's seat. I climbed back inside and closed the door, locking it out of instinct, even though I knew locks hadn't helped the night before. I leaned against the wall and slid down until I was sitting on the floor. I replayed the night in my head, minute by minute. Parking, locking up, crawling into the back, falling asleep, waking briefly to the van rocking. That was it. No memory of anyone entering, no sounds, no movement loud enough to wake me. The idea that someone could be inside my van without me knowing made my skin crawl. The space was small. Every sound carried. How had I not heard breathing, movement, the shift of weight? Unless they'd been careful. That thought stuck with me, heavy and awful. Careful meant deliberate. It meant intention. I forced myself to think logically. Maybe I had sat in the driver's seat without remembering. Maybe I'd stepped in mud and tracked it in myself. Sleepwalking. Half asleep confusion. I hated the explanation, but I needed something to hold on to. I checked my boots. Clean, dry, no mud. I checked my clothes. Same. Nothing that matched the marks on the seat. The impressions were wrong for my body anyway. Too broad in the shoulders. The height didn't line up. Whoever had been there had sat back fully, relaxed enough to leave a clear outline. I stood and looked at the seat again, closer this time. The mud had soaked into the fabric in places, darkening it deeply. In other spots, it was smeared thinner, like the person had shifted, leaned forward, adjusted themselves. The word made my stomach twist. I noticed then that the driver's seat was farther back than I'd left it. The adjustment lever was still down, as if someone hadn't bothered to return it to its original position. I hadn't imagined that. I grabbed my keys and started the engine, the sound loud and grounding. I didn't care anymore about resting or finishing my coffee or taking a moment to think. I wanted to leave. Now, as I pulled back onto the road, I watched the pullout in my rearview mirror until it disappeared. I half expected to see someone standing there, watching me go. Nothing appeared. I drove for hours without stopping, hands tight on the wheel, eyes scanning constantly. Every shadow on the side of the road made my heart jump. Every time I slowed down, I felt exposed. Eventually, hunger forced me to stop. I pulled into a busy gas station, parked in full view of the windows, and locked the van even though I was only stepping away for a minute. Inside, surrounded by people and noise, I finally felt my breathing slow. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't know how. Saying it out loud made it sound unreal, like a story that would earn polite nods and skeptical looks. I paid for my food, used the restroom, washed my hands longer than necessary. When I got back to the van, I checked the driver's seat again. The mud was drying now, cracking slightly along the edges. Still there, still real. I covered it with a blanket before getting back in. I couldn't stand to look at it anymore. The rest of that day passed in a haze. I kept driving until nightfall, then kept going longer than I should have, unwilling to stop somewhere quiet again. When I finally did pull over, it was in a crowded rest area with lights and other vehicles, and the low constant hum of traffic. I slept badly, waking at every sound, every shift of air. Each time I checked the front of the van, the blanket was still in place. No new marks appeared. In the morning, I drove to a car wash and cleaned the seat thoroughly, scrubbing until the water ran clear. I watched the mud dissolve and disappear, relief and anger mixing in my chest. Part of me wanted the evidence gone. Part of me wanted it preserved, proof that I hadn't imagined everything. I tried to forget about it after that. I really did. Life moved on. Other trips, other nights, other places to sleep. Most of them passed without incident. But something had changed. I stopped sleeping in the back, without a barrier between me and the cab. I rigged up a heavier curtain, then later a solid partition. I double-checked locks obsessively. I avoided isolated pullouts, even when I was exhausted. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch myself glancing at the driver's seat, half expecting to see new impressions forming on their own. Years later, I mentioned the story to a friend who worked in vehicle security. He listened quietly, then asked a few careful questions. When I told him about the footprints stopping at the door, the lack of exit tracks, the locked van, he went quiet. He told me there had been cases, rare but real, of people hiding inside vehicles for shelter or theft, slipping in unnoticed at gas stations or rest stops, wedging themselves into tight spaces until night. He said it was possible someone had already been inside my van when I parked, hidden somewhere I hadn't thought to check. The explanation made sense, too much sense. It fit the facts neatly, without leaving room for anything supernatural or unknowable. I clung to it because it was survivable. Still, there was one thing it didn't explain. If someone had been hiding inside, waiting for night, Why hadn't I seen any sign of where they'd been? No disturbed bedding, no shifted items, no evidence at all except the driver's seat. It was as if that was the only place they'd wanted to be. I don't sleep in vans anymore. Not like that. I still drive. I still travel. But I choose places where the world feels present, where silence doesn't stretch too thin. And every now and then, when I see an empty driver's seat in the early morning light, I feel that same tightness in my chest and remember how it felt to realize someone had been sitting there, inches away, while I slept, and how quiet they must have been to leave me dreaming. I woke up because my body felt wrong, not startled exactly, just nudged awake by something subtle and unsettling, like the sense that a room has changed while you were sleeping. I lay still on the mattress in the back of the van, eyes open, listening. The dark was thin now, the kind that comes just before morning. I could smell warm metal. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. I pushed myself up on one elbow and frowned, breathing in again, slower. Oil, dust, that faint heated scent engines give off after a long drive. My heart ticked up a notch. I hadn't driven since the evening before. I was certain of that. I remembered parking, cutting the engine, sitting for a minute with my hands on the wheel, letting the silence settle before climbing into the back. That memory was solid. I swung my legs over the edge and felt it immediately through the soles of my feet. The floor wasn't cold. It wasn't even neutral. It was warm. I froze, every muscle tightening at once, and stood there listening to my own breath get too loud. Warm meant recent. Warm meant not residual heat clinging on through the night. Warm meant something had happened while I was asleep. I stepped forward slowly, like the van might react to sudden movement, and reached the front. The driver's seat caught my eye right away. It wasn't where I'd left it. I was short and always pulled it close, knees bent, arms relaxed. Now it was pushed back several notches, angled slightly differently, like someone taller had been there and hadn't bothered to put it back. My mouth went dry. I reached out and touched the steering wheel. It was warm, not sun-warmed, not imagined, warm from hands. I backed away until the counter dug into my hip and forced myself to breathe. My thoughts scattered, grabbing at explanations that collapsed as soon as I examined them. Maybe I'd driven in my sleep. Maybe I'd woken and moved the van without remembering. Maybe I was still dreaming. I checked the doors. All locked. The windows were closed. Nothing looked forced or disturbed. My bag was where I'd left it. My boots were by the door. Everything was exactly the same, except the front of the van, which now felt haunted, occupied by a presence that lingered even though no one was there. I opened the side door and stepped out into the pre-dawn air, which was cool enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. The countryside was quiet, rolling gently away from the narrow dirt track I'd parked on. No houses close enough to see. No other vehicles. The sky was lightening slowly, that muted gray, blue that makes everything feel exposed. I walked around the van, scanning the ground. The dirt was dry and pale, perfect for showing marks, and there they were, fresh tire tracks. Not just mine. Another set overlapped them, sharper at the edges, pressed deeper. They led away from where I'd parked, curved down the track, then came back again, stopping right where my van now sat. I crouched and traced one of the grooves with my finger. It was crisp, recent. My pulse thudded in my ears as the shape of the night rearranged itself in my mind. Someone had driven my van. Someone had taken it somewhere and brought it back. And I had slept through all of it. I stood up too fast and felt dizzy, steadying myself against the side panel. I tried to remember if I'd heard anything. An engine, gravel crunching, wind rushing past, but the memory of the night was blank and heavy, like deep water. No interruptions, No sounds that had pulled me to the surface. I climbed back inside and sat in the driver's seat, more to anchor myself than anything else. It felt wrong under me, like sitting in a chair that still holds someone else's shape. I adjusted it back to my usual position, hands shaking, and stared out through the windshield. The logical part of my mind fought hard to regain control. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Someone had tried to steal the van, realized it wasn't worth it, and returned it. Someone local had thought it was abandoned and moved it for some reason. Every scenario felt flimsy. Why return it? Why leave no other trace? Why lock the doors again? I checked the ignition. No damage, no signs of tampering. The keys were still clipped inside my bag, exactly where I'd left them. That detail hit me hardest. Whoever had driven the van hadn't hot-wired it. They hadn't broken in. They'd had the keys. My stomach twisted. I dumped my bag out onto the bed, fingers clumsy as I dug through everything. The keys were there. That was impossible and undeniable at the same time. I held them in my palm, cold and familiar, and felt something inside me give way. I sat there for a long time, watching the light strengthen outside, listening to birds begin to stir, trying to decide what to do next. Leaving felt obvious, but also wrong, like running without understanding what I was running from. Staying felt worse. I started the engine. It came to life immediately, smooth and responsive, like nothing had happened. The sound grounded me a little. Machines were predictable. Machines did what they were told. I pulled back onto the track and drove slowly toward the main road, eyes flicking constantly to the mirrors. As I drove, I noticed more details that hadn't been there before. A smear of dirt on the inside of the driver's door. A faint scuff on the pedal where a different shoe had pressed. The radio was tuned to a station I never listened to, low volume. Static murmuring beneath a voice speaking Portuguese too fast for me to follow. I turned it off sharply, the silence snapping back into place. My hands were sweating on the wheel. I didn't recognize the road I was on anymore, even though I should have. It felt subtly rearranged, like I was seeing it through someone else's memory. When I reached the main road, I pulled over and just sat there, chest rising and falling too fast. Cars passed occasionally, their presence both comforting and jarring. Life was continuing as normal around me. I was the only one carrying this strange, heavy knowledge. I drove into town and parked near a cafe that was just opening, choosing a spot where I could see my van clearly from the window. Inside, the smell of coffee and bread wrapped around me, warm and human. I ordered something I barely tasted and sat there watching through the glass. Nothing happened. No one approached the van. No one looked at it twice. After a while, I felt foolish, exposed. I paid and went back outside, leaning against the van and running my hands along the panels, grounding myself in the physical reality of it. Metal paint, scratches I recognized, stickers I'd placed myself. It was still mine. I drove the rest of that day in a tight, focused state, hyper-aware of every sensation. I didn't stop anywhere isolated again. When evening came, I parked in a small, crowded area near other vehicles and slept badly, waking at every sound. The next morning, nothing was wrong. The engine was cold. The seat was where I'd left it. No new tracks appeared. Life slid back toward normal with unsettling ease. Over the following days, I tried to rationalize what had happened. I considered sleepwalking seriously, read about it in libraries and internet cafes. People did strange things in their sleep. Complex things. There were documented cases. It was rare, but not impossible. Except I'd never sleepwalked before, not once. And the idea that I could drive a vehicle, navigate unfamiliar roads, then return and secure everything without waking myself felt like a stretch even to me. A week later it happened again. This time, I woke to the sensation of motion, a gentle sway that stopped as soon as I surfaced. The engine wasn't running, but it was warm again. The seat was adjusted again, though not in exactly the same way as before. Different this time, as if a different person had been there. Outside, the tire tracks told the same story. Out and back, always back. That repetition broke something open in me. Whatever this was, it wasn't random. It wasn't a one-time mistake or coincidence. It was a pattern. I stopped sleeping deeply. I set up little tests, positioning objects in ways that would show if someone passed through the front. A cup balanced carefully, a folded paper placed just so. Each morning after the warmth, the seat change, the tracks, the objects remained undisturbed. Whoever was driving the van wasn't touching anything else. They weren't searching. They weren't stealing. They were only driving. I bought a cheap alarm system and installed it myself. Wires messy but functional. The next night I set it and lay awake, heart pounding, waiting. I don't remember falling asleep. I woke to silence and the faint smell of warmth again. The alarm hadn't gone off. The seat was moved. The engine was warm. I sat there shaking, tears slipping down my face without warning. Fear, frustration, exhaustion all tangled together. I felt invaded in a way I couldn't articulate, like my life was being borrowed without my consent. I left the van that day. I checked into a small guest house and slept for nearly a full day, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that leaves you disoriented when you wake. When I returned to the van, it was untouched, cold, still. I made a decision then, driven by something like desperation. I stayed awake all night, sitting in the driver's seat, lights off, watching, waiting. Nothing happened. The night passed quietly. The engine stayed cold. The next night, I did the same, and the next, each time nothing, no warmth, no movement, no tracks. The pattern finally became clear, and the realization landed with a hollow thud. Whatever was happening only occurred when I slept, not when I pretended to sleep, not when I rested with one eye open, only when I truly let go. I sold the van a month later. I didn't tell the buyer why. I cleaned it thoroughly, erased every sign I could find of those nights. Watching it drive away was harder than I expected, like losing something I'd once trusted. I still think about that time more than I want to admit. About the idea that my body might be capable of things my waking mind never witnesses. About how little control we really have when we surrender to sleep. I don't camp alone anymore, and I don't sleep in vehicles. When I wake now, the first thing I do is notice what feels different, what's out of place. Because sometimes, the most frightening thing isn't that someone else might take your life for a while. It's that you might never know when you gave it to them. I woke up because someone was telling a story right next to my head, their voice soft enough that it slid into my dreams. Before I realized I was awake, I lay very still on the narrow bed in the back of the van, staring at the fabric wall inches from my face, listening. The voice wasn't inside the van. It was outside, pressed close to the metal, whispering through it like the wall wasn't really there. At first I thought it was Mum and Dad talking quietly up front, forgetting I could hear them. That happened sometimes when they thought I was asleep. But this was different. The voice was younger. Not grown-up young, but not my age either. Somewhere in between. It spoke slowly, carefully, like it wanted to make sure I understood every word. Wah, and then she hid under the water until the shouting stopped. The voice said. I swallowed and pulled the blanket up to my chin, heart beating too fast. I didn't recognize the story. I didn't recognize the voice. I tried to tell myself it was the wind pushing through grass, that my brain was turning it into words the way it sometimes did at night. But the sentences were too clear, too shaped. I shifted slightly, the mattress creaking, and the voice paused. I held my breath. After a second, it started again, picking up exactly where it had left off, like it had been waiting. She learned that listening was safer than looking. That made my stomach hurt. I pressed my ear closer to the wall, without meaning to, wanting to hear better, even though every part of me knew that was a bad idea. The metal felt cool against my cheek. I could hear the voice more clearly now, the way you can hear someone through a thin door. "Who are you?" I whispered, barely moving my lips. The voice stopped. For a long moment, there was only the quiet hum of the night and my own breathing, loud and shaky. I felt stupid, embarrassed, already rehearsing how I'd explain this to Mum if I woke her up for nothing. Then the voice said my name. It didn't say it like a question. It said it like it already knew me, like it had been using my name in its head for a while. My chest went tight, and I curled my fingers into the blanket so hard they hurt. "How do you know my name?" I whispered back, even though I knew I shouldn't be talking. The voice laughed softly, not mean, not kind, just amused. "You talk in your sleep," it said. "You tell good stories too." I shook my head even though it couldn't see me. I didn't talk in my sleep. Mum would have told me if I did. I opened my mouth to say that, to argue, but the voice kept going, like it wasn't really having a conversation with me, just talking at me. "I like this place," it said. "It's quiet. People don't notice when you stay." I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to remember exactly where we were. We'd stopped late, after driving for a long time. Dad had said it was just fields, nothing around for ages. I remembered seeing dark shapes stretching out forever and feeling relieved that there were no houses nearby. That memory didn't feel good now. I slid my hand out from under the blanket and reached for the little flashlight I kept by my pillow. My fingers shook as they closed around it. I didn't turn it on. Light felt like it would make things worse somehow. "Are you alone?" the voice asked. That was when I knew I needed to wake my parents. I opened my mouth to call for Mum, but before any sound came out, the voice spoke again. Faster this time, urgent in a way it hadn't been before. "Don't," it said. "They won't hear me." "They never do." My throat closed. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I blinked them back, afraid that if I cried the voice would know it had won something. I didn't know what, but I knew it mattered. "Please go away," I whispered. The voice sighed like I'd disappointed it. "I can't," it said. "I'm only here at night." I didn't understand what that meant, and I didn't want to. I turned my face into the pillow and pressed my hands over my ears, but the words still slid through, muffled but clear enough to understand. It kept telling stories, not scary ones, exactly sad ones, about getting lost, about hiding, about learning which sounds meant danger and which meant nothing at all. The longer it talked, the more my fear tangled with something else I didn't want to admit, something like curiosity or pity. At some point, exhaustion dragged me under despite myself. The voice faded into the background, becoming part of my dreams, its words mixing with images that didn't make sense when I tried to hold on to them. I woke to sunlight and the sound of Mum moving around, the van alive with morning noises. For a few seconds, everything felt normal again. Then I remembered the night. I sat up too fast, heart racing, and pressed my ear to the wall where the voice had been. Nothing. Just the dull, ordinary quiet of daytime. I scrambled out of bed and pushed past Mum toward the door. Outside, the fields stretched empty in every direction. No houses, no tents, no cars, just grass and dirt and sky. Dad was already walking around the van, stretching, yawning. "There was someone here last night," I blurted out, my voice too loud. They were talking to me, Mum and Dad exchanged a look. The kind grown-ups think kids don't notice. Mum knelt down in front of me, her face soft but serious. "Was it a dream?" she asked gently. "No," I said immediately. "It was real. They were right there." I pointed to the side of the van. They knew my name. Dad walked over then, frowning, and looked where I pointed. He scanned the fields, the ground, the horizon. "There's no one around for miles," he said. "You must have heard the wind." It wasn't the wind. I insisted. It told stories. That was when I started crying, because I could hear how it sounded even to me, how impossible it all was. Mum pulled me into a hug, rubbing my back, murmuring that it was okay, that sometimes our brains did strange things at night. Dad checked the area anyway, walking farther out, calling out half-heartedly. He came back shaking his head. "Nothing," he said. "No tracks, no signs anyone was here." I watched his boots as he walked, noticing how clean the dirt was, how undisturbed. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. The voice had said people didn't notice when you stayed. We left soon after. Mum kept glancing back at me worried, and Dad drove faster than usual. I stayed quiet, replaying the night in my head, afraid that if I talked about it too much the details would slip away. For a long time, I convinced myself they were right, that it had been a dream shaped by the dark and the quiet and my own imagination. Kids hear things. Kids make things up. That's what everyone said when I tried to bring it up again. But years later, when I was older and better at noticing things, something clicked into place. I remembered how the voice had paused when I moved, how it had picked up its story exactly where it left off, how it had used my name without hesitation. Those weren't things dreams did. I went back to that area once as an adult, out of curiosity more than anything else. I stood by the side of the road and looked out over the fields, feeling small and exposed. Still no houses. Still nowhere someone could have been hiding. That was when I noticed how the land dipped slightly near where we'd parked, a shallow depression running along the edge of the field, hidden from the road. If someone lay there at night, close to the van, you wouldn't see them in the morning unless you were looking for them. I didn't stay long. I don't know who that child was, or where they went when the sun came up. I don't know if they were ever really there in the way we usually mean. All I know is that sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I remember the stories it told me, and I understand them in a way I couldn't then. Some people learn early how to stay quiet, how to press themselves into the edges of places where they won't be noticed. And sometimes, if you're a child, and you're listening closely enough, they find you in the dark and tell you their stories through the walls, trusting you because you're the only one who can hear them. By morning, they're gone, and everyone else believes they were never there at all. I woke to the sound of footsteps grinding softly in gravel, close enough that my body reacted before my mind did, heart jumping as if someone had touched me. I lay still in the back of the van, eyes open in the dark, listening. The steps moved past the side panel, slow and deliberate, then faded toward the rear. I waited for them to stop, to hear a door open, a cough. Anything that would explain why someone was so close. They didn't stop. They came back. The sound returned from the opposite direction. The same pace, the same weight, circling the van as if the person walking had chosen a path and was committed to it. Around and around, gravel crunching softly underfoot, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady. I held my breath, trying to catch something more than footsteps, some clue to who it might be. I heard fabric brush against metal once, faintly, like a sleeve grazing the side. My skin prickled. I hadn't heard any vehicle approach. I hadn't heard anyone arrive. Whoever this was had already been there when I woke up. I sat up slowly, careful not to make the mattress creak. The footsteps didn't change. They didn't speed up or pause. They just kept moving, tracing the same loop around my van, never drifting farther away. I checked my watch. Just after midnight. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding thin and wrong even to me. The footsteps didn't react. I waited, counting the seconds between each crunch, hoping to catch a break in the pattern. There wasn't one. The rhythm was unbroken, hypnotic in its consistency. Each pass took the same amount of time. Each step sounded identical to the last. I slid my feet into my boots and grabbed my jacket, heart pounding hard enough that I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. I moved to the front and peered through the windshield, straining to see beyond the faint outline of the orchard trees. Darkness pressed back, heavy and complete. I couldn't see a silhouette. Couldn't even tell where the footsteps were in relation to me without sound. They passed again, close to my head this time, and I flinched despite myself. I cracked the curtain by a centimeter and watched the side mirror, waiting for something to move through it. Nothing appeared. The footsteps continued, just out of sight, like they were deliberately avoiding the narrow angles where I could see. "Can I help you?" I asked, louder now, irritation edging into my fear. No answer, no change. I started to feel ridiculous, standing there talking to empty darkness, but the sound was real, too real to ignore. I tried to think logically. Someone passing through, a farmer checking his land, a local taking a shortcut. Any of those explanations should have ended by now. No one walks in perfect circles around a parked van for no reason. The footsteps kept going. I sat back down on the bed, hugging my knees, trying to calm myself. Panic wouldn't help. I focused on details instead. The weight sounded adult. The stride wasn't long, but it wasn't small either. The pace never varied, not even slightly. Whoever it was wasn't adjusting their footing or reacting to obstacles. They knew exactly where they were stepping every time. That thought made my chest tighten. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only minutes, I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming the beam at the floor, not ready yet to announce myself. The light steadied me. I took a breath and moved toward the door. The moment my hand touched the handle, the footsteps paused. I froze, fingers resting on cold metal. Silence pressed in so suddenly my ears rang. I waited, afraid to breathe. Seconds passed. Then, without warning, the footsteps resumed. Exactly where they'd left off. The same pace, the same loop. They hadn't stopped because I'd reached the door. They'd stopped because I'd broken the pattern. That realization sank deep and ugly into my stomach. I stepped back from the door and sat down again, heart racing. The footsteps continued as if nothing had happened, circling endlessly. I decided then that I wasn't going outside. I wasn't confronting whoever this was. Something about the precision of it all told me that engagement was exactly what was being avoided. Or worse, invited. I lay back down and closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound. It didn't work. The gravel was too loud, too insistent. Each step felt like a countdown to something that never arrived. Time stretched. I checked my watch again. 1 in the morning. The footsteps hadn't changed once. I started to feel angry. Fear curdled into frustration, then into something close to rage. "What do you want?" I shouted, sitting up again. "Go away." The footsteps didn't even hesitate. I slammed my fist against the wall, the metal booming in the quiet. For the first time, the steps faltered, just slightly, a half-beat stumble that sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I waited, breath held, heart pounding. Then they corrected themselves and continued, the rhythm restored, tighter than before. That was worse than silence would have been. My mind spiraled, searching for explanations that didn't make me feel like prey. Sleep deprivation, auditory hallucination, an animal. But animals don't walk in perfect circles. They don't keep time like that. And hallucinations don't respond, even briefly, to your actions. I counted the laps. 1, 2, 3. After 10, I lost track. After 20, I stopped trying. The sound burrowed into me, wearing grooves in my thoughts, making it hard to think about anything else. Sometime later, exhaustion pulled me into a shallow half-sleep where the footsteps blended into my dreams. I saw myself standing in the orchard, watching a path worn into the ground by endless pacing. I woke with a start when the sound sharpened again, closer than ever. I checked the watch. Just before dawn, the footsteps were still there. I felt hollowed out, like something essential had been scraped away over the course of the night. Fear had burned itself down to a dull ache. All I wanted was for it to end one way or another. As the sky lightened imperceptibly, the sound began to change, not in rhythm or pace, but in texture. The gravel crunch softened, less sharp. The ground must have been dampening with dew. The realization grounded me more than anything else had. Time was passing. Morning was coming. The footsteps kept circling. When the first weak light crept through the trees, I forced myself to sit up and look out. The orchard emerged slowly, rows of trees standing quiet and ordinary. I could see the ground clearly now. There were footprints, a single set pressed deep into the gravel, forming a perfect ring around my van. No breaks, no overlaps, just one continuous path, walked over and over until the marks blurred together. I watched as the footsteps passed again, now visible. Boots, muddy, empty, no legs, no body. Just the sound and the marks appearing as if someone invisible was still walking. My breath hitched painfully in my chest. I couldn't look away. I watched the prints form, each step pressing itself into the ground with the same careful pressure, the same distance apart. As the light strengthened, the sound faded, not abruptly, gradually. Each lap grew quieter than the last until finally there was nothing but morning birds and my own ragged breathing. The path remained. I waited a long time before opening the door. When I finally stepped out, my legs shook so badly I had to lean against the van. I walked the circle slowly, following the footprints with my eyes. They never crossed themselves. They never strayed closer or farther. Just a boundary drawn again and again. There were no tracks leading away. I left without eating, without packing properly, barely thinking at all. I didn't stop until I reached a town with people and noise and movement that felt overwhelming and necessary. Later, when I told myself the story I needed to believe, I said it had been someone messing with me, playing a cruel joke, walking until exhaustion set in and then slipping away. I said fear had filled in the gaps. But I know what I heard. I know how long it lasted. And I know that whatever walked around my van that night had no intention of ever leaving, only of waiting until I did. I don't sleep alone on orchard roads anymore. I don't stay where the ground can hold a memory of someone's steps. And when I hear footsteps at night now, I listen carefully, not to where they're going, but to whether they ever move away. I woke up choking on heat, the kind that makes your skin prickle before your eyes even open, and for a few seconds I thought I'd overslept into midday. I pushed myself upright on the mattress in the back of the van, heart already racing, and that was when I noticed how quiet everything was. Not peaceful quiet, sealed quiet, like sound had nowhere to go. I swung my legs down and felt the air shift strangely around me, heavy and still. The van smelled faintly of metal and rubber, sharper than it should have been. I reached forward to pull the side door open and felt resistance immediately. Not the usual stiff latch, something solid, unyielding. I frowned, half asleep, and pulled harder. The handle moved, but the door didn't. Confusion cut through the fog in my head. I leaned closer and looked through the narrow gap in the curtain. The door frame was shadowed, but I could see enough to understand what was wrong. There was a lock on the outside. Not my lock, not anything that belonged to the van. A thick metal clasp had been bolted across the door seam, secured with a heavy padlock. My stomach dropped so fast it felt like missing a step on stairs. I scrambled to the back doors, fingers clumsy, breath shallow. Same thing. Another clasp, another padlock. Both of them flush against the metal, neat and deliberate, like someone had taken their time. I pressed my forehead against the door and forced myself to breathe. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't an accident. Someone had come up to my van while I slept and added locks from the outside. My hands shook as I reached out and touched the metal through the thin gap where the door met the frame. It was warm. Not sun-warmed. Not residual heat. Warm like it had been handled recently. No, I whispered, the word barely making a sound. I backed away until my calves hit the bed and sat down hard, trying to think. My mind jumped wildly, grasping at explanations that didn't make sense. Maybe a ranger. Maybe locals protecting equipment. Maybe I'd misunderstood where I parked. I pictured the spot from the night before, the geothermal access road stretching quiet and empty, steam drifting low across the ground in places. I'd chosen it because it felt isolated but not hidden, a place people passed without stopping. That choice replayed in my head now, sour and sharp. I tried the driver's door next. Same resistance, another lock, same warm metal. Whoever had done this hadn't rushed. They'd locked every exit. I checked my phone with shaking hands. No signal, no bars, just the dull reflection of my own face staring back at me, eyes too wide, mouth too tight. I shoved it into my pocket like it might burn me. Okay, I said out loud, forcing steadiness into my voice. Okay. Think. Panic wouldn't help. I needed information. I needed to know if I was alone. I moved to the front and peered through the windshield. Pale light was creeping into the sky, early morning just beginning. The road was empty. No cars, no people. Steam curled lazily from vents in the earth farther off, blurring the distance. I knocked on the window, testing the sound. It was dull, swallowed by the space outside. I knocked harder. The sound felt small, insignificant. Help! I called, then louder, help. The word echoed faintly inside the van and went nowhere else. I paced the narrow space, heart hammering, trying to keep my thoughts from spiraling. Someone had done this deliberately, which meant someone might still be nearby, watching, waiting. The idea crawled over my skin. I pressed my ear to the wall and listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices. Just the faint, constant hiss of geothermal steam somewhere beyond the van, a sound that suddenly felt oppressive instead of comforting. I tested the locks again, rattling the doors harder this time, anger pushing through fear. Metal clanged uselessly. The locks held. My breath started to come too fast. Chest tightening, I forced myself to sit, plant my feet on the floor, and count. In, out. Slow. I wasn't trapped in a coffin. I had air. I had time. At least I thought I did. I checked the fuel gauge, half a tank. Enough to run the engine if I needed to, but for what? Noise? Heat? Drawing attention felt dangerous when I didn't know who had locked me in. I opened the cabinet and grabbed the small toolkit I kept for emergencies. Screwdriver, wrench, pliers. Nothing heavy enough to break a lock, but maybe enough to loosen the bolts holding the clasps. I chose the side door first. It felt closest, most personal. I worked carefully, fingers slipping as I tried to reach the bolts through the narrow gap. They didn't budge. Whoever installed them had used proper hardware, tightened them down hard. Sweat ran down my back despite the cool air. My hands ached. My breathing grew ragged again. I leaned my forehead against the door and squeezed my eyes shut. Images flooded my mind uninvited. Being left here, someone coming back later, someone deciding what to do with me like I was a thing, not a person. I shook my head violently, banishing the thoughts. Catastrophizing wouldn't save me. I moved to the driver's side and tried again, attacking the bolts with renewed determination. One of them shifted slightly, just enough to give me hope. I gritted my teeth and leaned into it, muscles straining. A sound outside made me freeze. Footsteps slow, measured, crunching softly on gravel. They stopped near the front of the van. My heart slammed so hard I felt dizzy. I backed away from the door silently, holding my breath. Through the windshield, I saw a shape move into view, distorted by the glass and the steam drifting past. Someone stood there. I couldn't make out details, just the outline of a person, hands at their sides, head tilted slightly as if listening. They didn't try the door. They didn't knock. They just stood. My mouth went dry. I wanted to scream. I wanted to disappear. After a long moment, the figure stepped back and moved out of sight. The footsteps receded, unhurried. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, shaking so badly my teeth chattered. Tears blurred my vision, but I wiped them away angrily. Crying felt like giving up. They're gone. I whispered to myself, though I didn't know if it was true. Minutes passed. Then more. I didn't hear anything else. No engine, no voices, just the constant hiss of steam. I forced myself back to the door. My hands were steadier now, fueled by something sharper than fear. I worked the bolt again, using the wrench for leverage, ignoring the pain as it bit into my palm. The bolt gave with a loud crack. I froze, listening. Nothing responded. I worked faster, adrenaline surging, loosening the second bolt until it came free. The clasp sagged. I fumbled with the padlock, testing it, then yanked the whole assembly away. The door still wouldn't open. For a horrifying second, I thought there was another lock I hadn't seen. Then I realized the door was stuck from pressure, warped slightly by the hardware. I shoved it with my shoulder. It opened. Cold air rushed in, sharp and clean, and I gasped like I'd been underwater. I stumbled out, half expecting hands to grab me, but the road was empty. I didn't stop to check the other doors. I ran around the van, heart in my throat, scanning every direction. No one, no movement, just my van sitting there with metal clasps bolted to it like evidence. I grabbed my phone and called emergency services, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. Still no signal. I swore aloud, frustration boiling over. I ripped the locks off the remaining doors as fast as I could, metal clattering onto the ground. When I was sure every exit was clear, I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The sound roared into the quiet, grounding and real. I didn't hesitate. I drove. I didn't stop until I reached a main road, then a town, then a place with people and noise and buildings that made me feel anchored to the world again. I pulled into a police station parking lot and sat there trembling, engine idling, afraid that if I turned it off everything would come crashing back. Inside, the words came out in a rush. Locks, warm metal, someone outside. The officer listened carefully, face unreadable, and asked practical questions. Where exactly? What time? Did I see the person clearly? They sent someone out to check the area. Hours passed. When they came back, their expressions told me everything before they spoke. No one there. No vehicle tracks except mine. No sign of anyone. They took the locks I'd brought with me, bagged them, promised to follow up. I nodded and thanked them and walked out feeling strangely hollow. I left Rotorua that day. In the weeks that followed, I replayed the night endlessly, trying to find a version of it that felt safe, contained. Maybe it had been a sick joke. Maybe someone thought the van was abandoned. Maybe it had been meant for someone else. None of those explanations accounted for the warmth of the metal, the timing, the way the person had stood outside, listening. I sold the van a few months later. I couldn't sleep in it anymore. Every creak made my heart race. Every shadow felt intentional. People asked why I stopped traveling that way. I told them I was tired. I wanted something different. That wasn't a lie exactly. Sometimes, late at night, I think about how carefully those locks had been installed, how someone had planned it, how close I came to being completely at their mercy. What scares me most isn't that someone locked me in. It's that they walked away afterward, that they trusted the locks to hold, that they didn't need to stay and watch.